Welcome, background historians. Today we dive into the era of the Black Plague and how much of a catastrophe it was. Whether you're driving, listening while you're cleaning, or watching on your phone in bed, next to your partner who's on TikTok. All I ask is, you leave a like if you enjoy. Let's get started. Imagine a world where the very air you breathed could be your executioner. A world where loved ones vanished overnight and the streets became open graves. Imagine a fear so profound it shattered societies, turned neighbor against neighbor, and redefined humanity itself. This isn't a nightmare. This was the reality of the 14th century when an unseen enemy, a silent predator, stalked the continents. It was known by many names: the Great Mortality, the Pestilence, but history would remember it as something far more chilling: the Black Death. Our story begins not in the teeming cities of Europe, but thousands of miles to the east in the vast, unforgiving steppes of Central Asia. Here, among the marmots and gerbils, lived a bacterium, Yersinia pestis. For centuries, it had existed in relative obscurity, a localized threat, but then humanity intervened. The burgeoning Silk Road, a network of trade routes connecting east and west, was a marvel of ancient globalization. It brought spices, silks, and ideas. But in the 14th century, it brought something far more sinister. Traders, unknowingly, became vectors. Their caravans carrying precious goods also carried a microscopic payload: infected fleas nesting in the fur of rats. These aren't just any fleas. These were oriental rat fleas, Xenosiliciopes. When an infected rat died, these fleas, desperate for a new host, would leap onto the nearest warm body, often a human. And with that bite, the invisible killer made its terrifying leap across species. He first recorded major outbreaks struck the Mongol Golden Horde in the 1340s. Legends speak of biological warfare, of plague-ridden bodies being catapulted over the walls of Kaffa, a Genoese trading post on the Crimean Peninsula. While the exact details are debated, the outcome was undeniable. The plague had reached the shores of the Mediterranean. From Kaffa, it was a short, fateful voyage across the Black Sea to Constantinople, and then, inexorably, to the bustling ports of Sicily and Italy. By 1347, the gates of Europe had been breached. The clock was ticking. Imagine waking up with a fever, chills, and an unbearable headache. Then, within hours, terrifying swellings appear in your armpits, groin, or neck. These were the infamous buboes, black, painful, and often the size of an apple. This was the signature of the bubonic plague, the most common form. But Yersinia pestis wasn't always so considerate. For many, the infection bypassed the lymphatic system, directly invading the bloodstream, leading to septicemic plague. Or worse, it attacked the lungs, resulting in pneumonic plague. This latter form was the most terrifying. It could be spread directly from person to person through coughing and sneezing, turning even a simple conversation into a death sentence. The speed of death was horrifying. A healthy person could be struck down and dead within days, sometimes even hours. Families were decimated. Entire villages were emptied. The scale of mortality was unprecedented. Historians estimate that within just a few years, a third to half of Europe's population perished, somewhere between 75 and 200 million people. To put that into perspective, imagine if half the world's population today simply vanished. Cities, once vibrant hubs of life, became charnel houses. Florence, a jewel of the Renaissance, lost over 50,000 people. London, Paris, Venice, no major urban center was spared. The sheer volume of the dead overwhelmed existing burial practices. Mass graves were dug, overflowing with bodies. The air reeked of death and fear. Faced with such an incomprehensible horror, how did people react? Their understanding of disease was primitive. They had no knowledge of bacteria, viruses, or epidemiology. To them, the plague was an act of God, divine punishment for their sins. This led to a surge in religious fervor, but also extreme fanaticism. Flagellants, groups of penitents, would march from town to town, publicly scourging themselves with whips, believing their suffering would appease God's wrath. They were a terrifying sight, spreading fear and sometimes even the disease itself. Others sought scapegoats. The most tragic consequence was the brutal persecution of Jewish communities. Already marginalized, they were accused of poisoning wells and spreading the plague. Thousands were massacred across Europe, often with the tacit approval of local authorities, a dark stain on history driven by fear and ignorance. For many, the breakdown of social order was complete. People abandoned their families, fleeing infected homes. Doctors, priests, and even undertakers often refused to help, fearing infection. The bonds that held society together frayed and sometimes snapped entirely. Boccaccio, the Italian writer, vividly described the scene in Florence in his Decameron, painting a picture of chaos, despair, and a profound sense of isolation. But amidst the despair, there were also acts of extraordinary courage and compassion. Some individuals, often driven by faith or love, tended to the sick, offering comfort in their final moments. Monasteries, though also ravaged, became places of refuge and care for the dying. The human spirit, even in its darkest hour, found ways to endure. For centuries, the true nature of the Black Death remained a terrifying enigma. Medieval doctors operated under the prevailing theory of miasma, the belief that disease was caused by bad air, noxious fumes, or corrupt vapors emanating from decaying matter. Their treatments were rudimentary and often ineffective: bloodletting, purging, herbal remedies, and the burning of aromatic substances to purify the air. The infamous plague doctor's mask, with its long bird-like beak, was not just a terrifying symbol. It was filled with aromatic herbs believed to filter out the miasma. It wouldn't be until centuries later, in the late 19th century, that the true culprit was finally identified. In 1894, during an outbreak in Hong Kong, two bacteriologists, Alexandra Yersin and Shibasaburo Kitasato, independently isolated the bacterium responsible. Yersin, working for the Pasteur Institute, ultimately had his name enshrined in history, Yersinia pestis. Their groundbreaking work, building on the discoveries of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, marked a pivotal moment in medical history. It wasn't divine wrath or bad air. It was a microscopic organism carried by fleas, transmitted by rats. The understanding of disease was forever changed.